So everyone, I just thought let's get going, because I know we all probably come from different starting points when it comes to politics. Some will say it's all about the personalities of individual leaders, and therefore the conflict between those different personality types. Others, it'll be about the system, what political structure is it, and what makes it will define the politics of your world. Others, it'll be a sort of based around the ideology of your world. You'll give it, often phrased as a sort of left-right spectrum, although often these get a bit hard to define in practice. And others, it's more down to earth, less of that high politics stuff. Such, maybe it's about cultivating some kind of virtue or universal truth or morality, with how moral your characters are, showing what their politics is like. For others, it's less about morality and more about education. Society progressing towards a certain point, and the more people educated in the right way to go, the faster it will ascend to the sort of end goal. Now, don't feel you have to use any of these silly drawings I make. These are just examples, but we'll get onto that in a minute. Others, it's a sort of cultural thing that certain places, certain cultures have inherent values, and I would be very cautious about using any of that idea because, well, the problem is that they do seem a bit silly. And that's the positive version of it, because we can also find that they become very stereotypical. Why? Because that means your politics is all defined by one thing. And yeah, I've grossly oversimplified the Cold War circa 1985 in this diagram. But just remember, something does not have to be morally grey to be complex. There are some pretty morally grey things that are not very complicated at all, actually. And some pretty complex things where there is definitely some kind of good, bad, that kind of thing. Point is, how you get that is you have different things interacting with each other. And we'll get onto that in a bit after some housekeeping.
Yojma Olu. Sorry if I've completely messed up their name. And we can have a world where she can write mysteries like she wants to. That'd be great. But I've got to tell you something. I ain't your hero. I ain't a hero. I ain't the saviour. I'm sure you can all have your own opinions on who the saviour was, and I got a lot of things going for me. Comfortable house, family, education, the society that doesn't necessarily think I'm inherently criminal, and people who look roughly like me on screen, perhaps. Although perhaps seem a little bit different in certain other ways. Hence why the people who had the similar mannerisms to me tended to be German officers who, if I'm lucky, were fighting for the Kaiser or the Soviets or what have yous. No worries. But that's the point. So as I say, it goes into that, hence the thumbnail having that rainbow white and green. No worries, however. But, it's important to know where we're coming from talking about politics, so I'm not going to save the world, but we are. It's like all of us, really. We can all do something to help out one another, and so I just want to do that and give people give marginalised people space. space to grieve, space to be angry, hey, space to be happy, space to enjoy life, space to celebrate who they are, but also hope that things will get better someday, and hope that because after all, perhaps we need to perhaps the first step to finding and building a better world is imagining a better world. And still, though, there is another thing to talk about. Me education in politics. Where did it come from? Well, I'm going to present a theory list of some of it now. And now we're back. I'm going to tell you the main bulk of it. Because, yeah, I did politics at A level. I also started a history and politics degree at a university. Dropped the politics after a year. I found it unrealistic. Most of where I learnt politics were on the streets, as it were. Canvassing, leafleting, party meetings, letter writing campaigns. And that which Winston Churchill described as the best argument against democracy. A 5-minute conversation with the average voter. Not that I agree with Winston Churchill, mind. Yeah. But, you know, that's how it is. So as I say, wanted to make sure we were all understood where's I was coming from. And, well, nothing in this video is going to be objective, so hope you have a good time with this video coming forward and hope it helps with your writing. Well, see you in a bit, Lai.
Ja, und Englisch ist niemals mein erste Sprache und Joishmalay ist mein Techniker, ist Verbot.
Hello. Oh, and just another quick note before we carry on with the presentation sort of aspect of it, is that the whole stuff, I hope it didn't sound too crass or terse or anything. And you know, there are people who are far worse off than I am, so worry about them first. Don't worry about me too much. I'll be okay. And hey, I've also been having issues with mental illness for quite a while and hearing voices in my head, some of which I repurposed as characters for the Expanded Universe. You know the one where I put on some funny shirt, pick up have a textbook, and they're like arguing in certain positions and stuff like that. You've probably got, if you've seen the political compass, or how I stopped worrying and learnt to love the memes. You've probably seen them there. Seen some of them there. But point is, I just want to say thank you to everyone who knows me for who I am, knows who I am, and knows all the stupid stuff I say, and still wants to be my friend. Thank you.
Hi everyone. So let's carry on and look at the context in which your world takes place. Because your people will not be idly sitting by letting events happen, because they've got needs too. Those needs I've grossly oversimplified for education purposes, but I broadly put them down into two categories. A physical kind, getting your food, your warmth, your shelter, utilities, all that sort of thing, symbolized by this nice loaf of bread, which I call the need to eat. Then there's the more psychological, the more spiritual, the more social aspects of human existence, or the existence of any human-like species, symbolized by these two ladies playing their electronic game which I'm calling the need to meet. Now, people have different amounts of these needs and different needs within them in different amounts, so they interact with one another, and thus some kind of rules of social interaction need to come about. Now, don't worry, these rules can be informal or formal. They can be centralized and imposed from the top down or from the grassroots. And let's talk about the way people can operate, because you see there are ways in which you kind of persuade people to move down different paths. And again, grossly oversimplifying, I've created I didn't create these categories, but here they are. Persuading people to do things. Now, bear in mind, you don't need to do any of these if this is something people want to do already, but if you wanted to do something different, you could persuade them, show them the logical merits, the spirit, the moral obligation, the spiritual fulfillment, this kind of use of some kind of argument. You could incentivize them, reward through physical means like payments, or in more complex cases, show them that they will be better off as a people group or as an individual if you give them these things. If they do what you say, if they follow your instructions, if they pursue this path, they will be better off. Or indeed the converse, they will be worse off if they go with someone else or some other idea in the sort of physical sense. Then, of course, there's coercion, the power. But bear in mind, this doesn't just exist as the simple do it or I hit you kind of thinking, but there's also the do this or I won't be able to stop someone else hitting you. And of course, laws, rights. It is almost, in a sense, has that coercive side to it. If one does not fulfill certain obligations, I can bring the state down upon you to make you fulfill them or punish you for not doing so. That will be in this category as well. Now, speaking of the state, let's look into it, because a lot of people think that our current political system, capitalism, is the only one that can feasibly exist, or that, others may have existed in the past, but they really didn't work. They just fail. So let's have a bit of a look-see. because I've identified, I'm roughly breaking these down into 4 categories of political systems, and yes, there are a lot more varieties you can do within them, but we'll get onto that later. So let's go back in time and have a quick look-see. So here we have what I like to call the decentralized means of production. During this time, there might be some local leadership, but mostly people know each other. And you might think, oh, like hunter-gatherers? Not necessarily. You know, colonies often had this situation where transport and time to reach the motherland is distant. And, you know, this was even quite a common thing in the British Isles until about 1,000 years ago. So, but the point is, so importantly, how do people meet their needs to eat? Well, they have individual skills. The blacksmith, the potter, they use their own individual talents to make things, and then provide those for their community in exchange for the various needs being met, for the various material needs being met. It's all kind of ad hoc, though, in a lot of ways, because it's about whether you can have materials. And speaking of community and sharing those maybe for some monetary value or not, but we have the thing that regulates the need to meet, the social calendar, symbolized by this very lovely couple on their wedding day, and well, had many happy returns if it was like the actual wedding, or if it was like staged for thing. Everyone seems happy, so that's good. So what creates the regulation of people's needs to meet and eat? Well, of course, the local festivals will be part of people's lives, but also the local community would pretty much settle these matters among themselves. And hence why it's important to recognize these systems. You know, if you want, you don't have to have an ancient setting, and you don't have to go post-apocalyptic. As I say, you know, you could even have space or colonies, and of course, these systems build upon one another, because at that very lowest level, like, think of your own life. You know, think of neighborhoods. People live around people in their communities. People talk to one another. So that happens in life. So why not use it in your books? And then we get the next system, the first one that's fully centralized. Well, sort of. It's at least somewhat centralized, called feudalism, whereby the realm, they have a job of providing some kind of overarching security that isn't influenced by any other force, in theory, and they provide a sort of adjudicating body. You know, ironically, monarchs in the medieval world and the ancient world where this existed were often more a judicial head of state than an executive one. Their job, hence why the king held court. People would come to him because they wanted redress. And quite often peasants got aided in the king's court because it was in his interest, because otherwise, well, the barons, the land, the aristocracy, or the organised religion of the clergy might gain more interest. Speaking of which, economic life, the need to eat, is very much familially controlled. Often, you know, on the macro level by aristocratic families who own who are the major landowners, but even at the micro level, trades were often passed down, father to son, mother to daughter. Yes, that did happen. And, you know, especially in the textile industry, as my Lancastrian family know quite well. But anyway, you know, this would be family in the medieval period. And, for example, Families would spread their trade down, and then organized religion, and creating not so much a frame of rules at this time. A lot of people will associate religion with rules these days, but in a way it was more about structure in this time period. Rules were important, but there was also the structure of life and people living. So what changed? Well, got a rise of a group known as the middling sort, who would eventually rise to become the capitalists and bring about our current political system of capitalism, which requires a state to protect the interests of capital, and creates an interesting paradox. Because on the one hand, the whole premise is that we've broken free of the feudal restraints of familial and religious tie, and every voice is equal in our liberal democracy. But we also know under capital that we have this hierarchy of capitalism, and well, if only one person owns the means of production, it's gonna get pretty hierarchical pretty quickly. So how does this work? Well, as I say, we'll get onto that later, but there is what we call an unequal distribution of wealth. If some people own the means of production and others have to work it in order to survive, well, it gets a bit complicated because, as I say, needs to meet their needs to eat. You need to earn a wage or something like that, unless you're a capitalist. If you want to meet people, well, public land is now private. They just, bought up the public land. Now they are venues run for profit. And often the only way you can participate is to vote. And nothing wrong with voting. Voting's great in a lot of ways. But if that's all you can do, tick a box from a pre-selected list of those who can afford to run, yeah, that can lead to that situation where, yeah, there are some pretty equal voices, where everyone's supposedly equal, but there's definitely some people more equal than others. I can tell you that. Anyway, so there's another point in this, because obviously, well, there's another thing we have to address. Class, and how it can't, in a lot of ways, be separated from race, gender, sexuality. Oh, and when race, we're also including ethnicity with this one. But anyway, with gender, race, sexuality, ethnicity, disability as well, but that's not always talked about as much. And you might be here thinking, is that really true, Ed? And the answer is yes. But you may want to know why. Well, there's a thing about state and capital. They need categories in order to protect their private property. In order to regulate a society, a state needs definition, clarity, because the thing about capital is that it gains profit from minusing the risk. Capital isn't using land or a physical product to make its money. I mean, those might be in the end points, but it accumulates a whole lot from investment. Ever wonder why the stock market's seen as so important to life these days? That's why. Capital very much relies on confidence, on safety. It's a fiat. And the government is the state, more accurately, is the guarantor. And it thus needs these categories to maintain a sort of safety, because infinite varieties and infinite combinations to a capitalist is risk that cannot be allowed, or at least can only be allowed in very, 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 very limited degrees that are preferably monetizable. And so people need to be held in rigid categories. I mean, you may have also, and yes, you may have heard that capitalism was based on colonialism. That is true to an extent, but I also wanted to say this part because I get worried that that creates also the naive assumption that now that we've officially decolonized that you know, stuff like racism will go away. But no, that's not how it works. But people need to be put into categories for a capitalist system to operate. In fact, pretty much any statist system. I mean, we'll get onto these variants of capitalism later, but bear that in mind. People need to be categorized for a cap. So, you might be wondering how to make things a bit more varied. Well, the thing is, the means of production might set the general rule set, but for the specifics and what players are on the board, as it were, there we have society, societal structures, and all these kind of social aspects that also change a lot quicker, both in which are valued more, which are seen as greater, the relationship between them, and what's valued within them. And I have simplified these and done somewhat generic versions for the sake of making it adaptable to different settings. But they should still be helpful. And don't feel the need to treat any of these as mutually exclusive. After all, some of the best ways to make your writing feel flat is to have everything defined by just one thing. And also, these are pretty abstract concepts, so I've used some photos of some lovely ladies to help illustrate them because well, they are the closest to my own aspirations within these as in how I saw myself out of Pond 5's extensive library of stock photos. So let's begin. Because people will look to eat and to meet, and out of these, as a society grows, out of these we get things forming. Identities, beliefs, educations, private life, and public life. So let's discuss each of these. Identity, how to form it. Now, obviously, these can vary incredibly large amounts, so I'm going to sort of give you some ideas here of some categories that are, they're done discreetly here for the sake of education, but don't feel the need to be restrictive. But the question is, from what do identities form? Maybe they form out of a common experience that an individual within them will share with other people. You know, that sense of self, which we call, you know, identity being a sense of self, and self, one could form it out of experience, perhaps. Maybe it's out of a common struggle. A group of people might share a sense of oppression, you know, or an oppression, or something like that, past, present, and hopefully not future, but they're hoping to break down together or mutually support each other through. Or, of course, what someone does. You know, a sense of, just, you know, how many workplace identities exist. You know, people sometimes might say, I'm a builder, I'm a plumber, and share those common experiences of life with those who share that kind of profession, as it were. The sense of, where do I fit into society as a whole? And we have beliefs. Commonly misunderstood, perhaps, but because some people think they have to be religious. Now, they don't necessarily have to be religious, but they can be sort of like, but basically think of these as sort of cogent, seriously held, and a point missed out from the Mayor's four-starter ruling, in my opinion, was that they provide a basis for conducting one's life. They're not just mere opinions on a single issue, but something that people make their life decisions around 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. But, you know, where are these beliefs rooted? Are they rooted in a specific folklore, a culture, a sense of, you know, a specific people group? Maybe they're rooted in some universal truth that anyone can access, handed down to them, as opposed to like certain rituals from certain traditions that people have. These ones are more about a moral truth, or truth that is absolute and for everyone. But there's another way of doing that as well. The individual, perhaps these beliefs form out of individual philosophy relative to the self, and personal philosophizing, personal coming to understanding. Beliefs can come from there too. Then we get education. Not just one's level of academic attainment, because academia itself is a social structure that exists, but we're talking more about the purpose of an education. Basically, what is someone meant to get out of it? Are they meant to learn how to produce, you know, be productive, a productive worker for their society? Are they meant to be the critical thinker who comes up with the new ideas and leads people through to the light of truth? Is education meant to give them a certain sense of place? A sense of, this is our community, this is our people, these are who we are, and here's how you fit into it. And of course, one's private self. What is one meant to do with oneself? What does it mean to be a good person, as it were? Or how does one grow or more accurately for a society perhaps, how does one grow as a person? Is it by cultivating a set of socially agreed virtue or norm or ritual? Is it perhaps by honing a specific practical skill? As a specialist and becoming a specialist in your field? Or is it more of an emotion? You know, the emotivist thing that it's more in flux based on how we feel, and it's perhaps about cultivating one's feelings to provide a greater sense of meaning as a person and an individual. Speaking of which, then the question comes of public life. What does one do to cultivate one's public self when one is out in amongst one's fellow citizens, or other designation for members of the polis? Is one meant to be perhaps the doctor who heals the social ills of the day, who has the answer, correcting the social errors? Is one perhaps meant to be the manager of various conflicting views, trying to create some kind of reconciliation and sort of unilateral compromise between conflicting forces? Or is perhaps the public sphere merely the transactional space of the private sphere? Here, where individuals make their individual choices, is with other individuals. This public space is in a sense an illusion based on the cumulative effect of all those transactions. You know, essentially, so it could be like this. And as I say, none of these are mutually exclusive. So, one might have noticed a little problem that we're getting. you know, with all these different interests, ideals and such, these, as it were, institutions, and the fact that the state, for the way a state is structured as a monocentric power system, can create this thing called the problem of liberal democracy. Sometimes it's called the problem of republic, but I think that that's a very bad name. And yes, I'm not a Republican, but still. You see, that's this sort of duality of the liberal democracy. Because it's a moral basis for social governance, especially as one cannot negotiate with it, with the state in the same way, because one is part of the state. Because as we know, under a capitalist political system, the organisation of and regulation of the means to eat and the needs to meet are all centralised in the nation state, most commonly these days. We'll get on that later. And so we have this system. But technically everyone's meant to be equal. But of course, with the sort of power brokerage, so to speak, of the fact that access to the ability to organise is contingent on holding resources, this does create a slight, how one says, problem of a paradox where everyone is equal, but some are more equal than others, to use a phrase that now feels trite. Anyway, now, even those who call it the problem of republic have said that it's not just monarchy that gets rid of this system by, you know, taking out that whole everyone's equal thing. Because, you know, they would concede that technically an anarchist system would also get rid of this by taking out the centralised authority in its naturally hierarchical state. Because after all, if only one group gets to make the laws, if one group gets to make the rules, then it will create a hierarchy. But we all know, but of course, if that isn't the case, but if the rules are made decentralised, that's, well, anyway, we'll get onto that later. So how do we get around this problem? Well, there is a Hobbesian method. I mean, of social contract. Now, I'm not going to go too much into social contract. It's very boring, and from a writer's perspective, it's not really the Hobbes version isn't really very useful. His idea is, well, you're still alive, aren't you? Yep, therefore you've consented to be part of the system, even if the system doesn't seem to represent you at all. His argument that even a slave has chosen to live as a slave rather than die is very hard line and not really supported much, even by other Enlightenment thinkers. I mean, there's a slight evolution upon it. There's an evolution that perhaps takes some inspiration from this idea. The idea of voting. You know, you come together on polling day and pick the people, therefore legitimacy restored. Yeah, you get to choose from a list of people already chosen for you by people who have the resources to organise politically, and does kind of silence the voice outside of polling day, if you think about it. But it's still an idea, and yeah, might seem why a lot of people feel disenfranchised if the only way they can participate. I mean, they could work for a political party, but then they got to hope that they're still being listened to, and often their voices feel drowned out. But, you know, that's not so much a thing a writer might have. But hey, just one thing to remember. Writing about a world you might want to write about is probably not a world you want to live in. So let's move on. So there's another idea, perhaps more drawing on John Locke's thinking about social contracts and negative freedom, and the idea of everyone being an individual who meets to perform their business with other people. So, like, there isn't any specific social interest or public interest. There are just private groups. These groups form up and they vie for what they want in their society, with the government's role through things like textual approach to law, which tends to favour the legislature, checks and balances, and a strong emphasis on negative freedom, i.e. freedom from rather than freedom to, is to create healthy competition between the different groups. Now, this society can tend to veer towards what's called a meritocracy. The idea that in theory, an individual's power, wealth and such derives from their own merits, usually as a wealthy individual who ends up having a lot more influence in society than other people, other than other wealthy individuals, and unlike a laissez-faire system, can call upon the state to deal with their competitors, or at least below a certain level. But so private life can be very favoured by this system and elevated in its political power through the mastery of resources, which, although one might question the nature of said merits, but this is a theoretic, but as I say, it's a theoretical name, and as I've already said, my English can be a bit poor sometimes with technical terms. But of course, beliefs can also be quite elevated in importance by this system, because while a wealthy individual who's grown their business creates supply, beliefs are very strong with demand, and because they have the social power of a society and can use that leverage to make their voices more heard. It can be more difficult for other institutions, such as identities because they're very sectional, as it were, or public life, of course, because of the stringent checks and balances and somewhat restrictive interventionism. Although bear in mind, this is not a system of small government. As I say, small government doesn't send state troopers to break up union actions and tell everyone that those unions are just a self-interested bunch of people undermining the country's interest because this, like, one business owner, they are the national interest. Anyway, and also that nature can also mean that these sort of educative forces, that institution might be weaker as well, due to technical skills being largely derived towards then basically broken up into their industries. That can make it a bit harder for them to rise, which is why this system could tend towards the meritocracy or theocracy. I mean, some might call that meritocracy or plutocracy, but I'm going to use the term plutocracy later for something else that's a bit different. Anyway, let's move on, because there is another way of trying to solve the problem, more along the Rousseauian line, whereby there is ultimately a public interest, what Rousseau would have called the general will, although public interest seems to be a more common vocab these days, where the role of the state is to essentially organise society in a proactive system, emphasising positive freedom, i.e. your freedom to rather than freedom to bring society together towards a general will. And yes, this can get quite bureaucratic because there is a natural tendency towards administration. This empowers an administration, and the executive government is much stronger in this system as it's a very regulatory kind of approach, which also can make those technicians, those who understand those with a specialized education, technicians can include economists, hence why this could also lead to a technocracy if we're not or of course the general will could be more identitarian, as it were. each sort of subsection of a society, advancing their interests, bringing them forward, overcoming oppression and oppression, yes, in a good, and or perhaps going even further to the point where they get to dominate everything, although that's very rarely done in practice. But the point is, you end up with what one might call a fedocracy, where each subsection of society has to be appeased for anything to actually happen, and fun fact, identity politics isn't quote-unquote left-wing inherently. Right-wingers, quote-unquote right-wingers often use identity politics as well. And we can see that in a little moment. Because there's another thing, more thinking around the works of Schumpeter, perhaps. And this idea of unity. For the state, that there is a society of many different people, many different parts, and the government has a very simple function with that, and that is to unify everyone, bring them all together in service of the state against the common enemy. And hey, when that common enemy is very clear, be it the Nazis, as a classic example, where you can definitely tell someone is invading Europe, is trying to conquer the world, what have you. Yes, this can often, at least for the moment, seem very good. It might even seem like a righteous form of government. Yeah. But as Eisenhower warned of the military-industrial complex, these things don't often just disappear after the war's over. The old thing how Cincinnatus used to beat the Gauls and then return to his farm, that's pretty rare, historically speaking. And so we can get another little problem. Ironically, the one that brought about the Hitler in the first place, because what if the enemy, the foreign enemy, is not so intangible? And what if they're not so foreign? Who could be this thing trying to destroy our nation in its very survival? Who are they? Could it be your neighbours, your friends, everyone around you, the people you know and love? Oh no, this runs deep after all. We don't know who the threat is. Who's behind the threat? Well, is it our safety? It's our safety that's at stake. Yes. Leaving you just constantly in fear, because everyone around you could be the enemy, could be trying to destroy your very way of life and everything you love. But don't worry, the state is here. The state is here to look after you, to protect you, to keep you away from all those horrible, horrible enemies. And yes, your human rights and your civil liberties they are a necessary sacrifice while the struggle is ongoing, though it never ends. Of course, and often these other groups, we can start targeting them, and just remember to obey your bosses. After all, we all know that the corporations and the plutocracy that run this country is, of course, good citizen, there to protect you and look after your nation's interests. Protecting everything you love, everything you hold dear. And of course, dissent, disagreement is not okay, because disagreement is dissent, don't you know, citizen? Disagreement is dissent, and dissent is collaboration with the enemy. The enemy that we haven't exactly defined very well, but that's the point. We will use it, and it'll be some other group or somewhere. And you can't organize, after all, those groups that one might work with. they're working with the enemy, you know, because they're against the government and the corporate and the plutocratic interest. So you can't turn against them. But yes, that sounds pretty scary, doesn't it? So I want to end this section on a slightly nicer alternative version of unity. Less around a common struggle against an external foe, and more the common struggle against internal problems, human suffering, welfare. Not necessarily a socialist thing, after all, Bismarck wanted to crush communism with kindness. But, you know, certainly better than that which we were just talking about. Anyway, we've got another section to deal with. Well, everybody, thanks for joining me again so far. And, you know, I have to be honest, a lot of these past presentations have been rather dry. You know, a lot of abstract theory and not very much that's exciting about the presentation slides or anything that I was showing you. And hey, I get that they could get quite hard, you know. When I was studying a lot of this and trying to find out about all these things, I was finding myself grasping with some pretty hard concepts. So let's make it a bit more tangible and talk about some boobs. Now, you might be thinking about boobs, and so let's go to a nice place to see. So we got this gentleman getting out of swimming pool. He ain't got his shirt on, nipples fully in view. No worries, that's fine, he's just been swimming, no problem. And, well, imagine there's a lovely lady in the pool as well, similarly attired, or not. And turns out I can't show you any of that. I don't know exactly why. Oh yeah. Yeah, it's sort of error. Image blocked by the great firewall of Google. Oh dear. Well, so you might be thinking, Ed, come off it, mate. Everybody knows boobs are sexual things. You know? And I'd like to ask you, why is that? I mean, you know, from a naturalistic standpoint, they feed babies. You know, when you ain't got teeth, little num-num. You know, so you need to like suckle on your on your mamas, to get some nutrients in you, to get the nutrients in you, mate. That's food. That's not sexual. Now, yes, it is true that humans are the only animals whose mammary glands are permanent, because other mammals, they retreat back into the body after the nursing period is completed. But still. And anyway, hence why some other cultures, they don't sexualize the boobies in the same way. You know, in some places it's more like buttocks, that kind of more the thing, or, you know, the leg, or, you know, thighs. They're kind of more some people's thing. So, you know, it's not an inherently thing that's just a part of human nature. Also with men. And men's bodies are seen as like objects of desire, or lack thereof. You know, being short, not quite as ripped as this fella here. Here, a male's sexual desirability is seen in terms of his ability to, you know, his power or agency. Not to mention being short in, let's just say, another area can also cause anxiety. And even then, that's not necessarily a biological thing after all. After all, the you know, the clitoris is external, and, you know, apparently it's girth more than length that creates pleasure. But so that's for another day. Hey, look, I said this video was not necessarily age appropriate for all ages. And speaking of sex, why do we shun it so much? You know, for a lot of people, it's great. Some people want to have, or, you know, and it forms a warm and happy part of a loving, mutually supportive relationship. What's so wrong about that? You know, sure, you know, it involves bodies and stuff, but what's so bad about those? You know, but also, women are people. They have choices. You know, but yeah, women get turned into sex objects. Not just women, of course. I mean, in a lot of ways, the society doesn't like to talk about men. Men get reduced to sexual objects as well, as do plenty of other genders. You know, patriarchy sucks for men as well. But, you know, there are some contexts where people might actually like somebody to see them in a sexual way. At least every so often. And maybe not all the time, but, you know, sometimes that's a part of what makes them feel happy, feel alive, feel loved even, as well as something like that. And also, you know the lady who's at the central photo of this? Here's her again, in a photo playing with her hat. Just having a lovely time of life. Because, you know, I actually found that photo, the photo that I'm using as the sort of biggest image on this slide. It's a big image on this slide. And it was labelled confident and charismatic. So, hey, we're not saying it's wrong to celebrate people. Just remember, probably one of the best things to remember, is that whatever bits you like of someone, their boobs, their abs, their buttocks, their legs, their thighs, their... how do you say it again? Wilhelm de Vonheid Wunderweiner? I am sorry, I've probably butchered a phrase from Roma Army, and I'd just like to apologise for that. You know, it's manhood. You know, whatever parts of a person you quite like. Maybe you quite like their personality as well. That's another one. But just remember, there is a human being attached to all the parts you like. Someone who perhaps also wants to be loved, feel beautiful, feel dignified, feel alive and love and deserving of love and respect. I think that's probably an important thing to do as a writer, or as anybody really. Respect the people you're with and that you're talking about. Try and be a bit more, you know, that kind of respect. So anyway, but speaking of which, there are lots of assumptions we make about people, like men and women. Why can't they just be friends? Why can't men cry? Why is it so bad to take a bit of time to relax? You know, a lazy day. Why is that seen as such a bad thing to do? Why is a woman's body seen as inherently sexual just by being on display? I mean, look at this lady in the photo. It doesn't have to be sexual at all. She's just in a swimming pool, having a swim. Or resting by the pool, after maybe having a swim or something. It's nothing. There's nothing necessarily sexual about that. But some people will make it so. Speaking of which, you know, we sort of exoticize, fetishize groups, like this Latina woman. Might well be seen as a sort of object to desire. Why do we do that to people who are outside the in-group that we've been told we're a part of? Why is that? You know, why are people of other cultures, why are other cultures seen as like sort of exotic and desirable? Why is certain forms of life, you know, why do we assume that everyone wants to get married and that couples exist for reproduction and that reproduction is an inherent part of a relationship? and that everybody wants to reproduce, unless they've got a physical or neurodiverse disability, as it were. Well, then the social expectation is for them not to reproduce. And hey, none of these are things that I think are bad for you personally, in a lot of ways. Well, but it's how you view other people and the boxes you put other people into it. You want to be a stoic man? Fine. You like being productive? Fine. You want to reproduce? Fine. Just don't foist it on other people, okay? Speaking of all the sex and stuff, why do we see it as a nasty, dirty, horrible thing to want to be into, even though we seem to tell everybody that that's what you should be wanting and we should be getting, and that relationships are inherently a part of it. Funnily enough, at church they actually taught, one of the things they were teaching us in our confirmation class was that relationships don't have to be sexual. But there's a lot of people out there who try and encourage people to think of relationships as inherently sexual things. So where do a lot of these assumptions come from? Now, you might have heard the idea that they are historical truths. The way things have always been, passed down through the centuries. Well, Roman men cried. Medieval people thought hair was much more of the allure of a woman than her boobs were in a lot of ways. But point is, so these aren't entirely true. A lot of these values have changed over time. Some people might tell you, well, yeah, but things are there are certain truths that are baked in our DNA, but even that doesn't explain everything. We're not still hunter-gatherer apes or chimpanzees or something. And of course, why would we develop an ought? That moral sense of, yes, but is this how things should be? Because logically, well, if we're trying to be good enough, because, yes, even if evolution is less about who's the best and more about what's good enough to survive, although quite a few people misunderstand it and think it's the former, it still doesn't quite explain how these changes happen. Some might say, well, yeah, it's a social change model, but it's all really what people deep down want. Really? I only ask because quite a few people have even told me, yeah, why do we think of stuff like that? When you start to think about it, it's like, wait, so why do we see women's nipples as inherently more sexual than men's? Why is it more acceptable for a man to be topless in public than a woman? Socially speaking, why? So, or maybe there's some kind of religious explanation? Maybe, but let's be honest. The ancient and medieval world were quite religious and quite open about all that sort of stuff. And to be quite honest, speaking as a former Protestant, I don't think it was the Reformation that did it. Hence why we see similar changes in various places around the similar social development. A development I'll get onto in a bit. Some might say, as why some have even argued that perhaps it's more feminism. The idea that feminism is the new Puritanism, which is kind of silly because a lot of, women want to take control of their bodies, not force them all into a rigid system. And yeah, there are maybe some feminists might be getting at women who want to be a we shouldn't really say stay-at-home mum. But what I mean is women who just want to raise a family and all that. Some feminists do get at them for it, but really, if you believe in a woman's choice, you kind of ought to support a woman's choice to do that as well. And plenty of them do. So let's just leave that there. Speaking of patriarchy, maybe some say, well, it's about the man's purpose to be the breadwinner, to be the provider, the protector, and his wife to be there for his to satisfy his needs, which really, and then they'll appeal to some time-honoured tradition that when you give it some close scrutiny in the medieval era and beyond, you realise, actually, no. Medieval women worked. Everyone came out to assist the harvest. It doesn't really compute or add up. But all these various different values and rights and liberties and all such come together when we see the rise of the middling sort. Now, it is reductive to say that everything exists the way it does because of capitalism. Partly because there are very, very, very many different ways of varieties for capitalism to happen. And why the Europeans perhaps aren't so bothered about boobage as people in Europe, as people in North America. But there are still certain social norms, certain ideas, especially with that degree of insecurity, where security, as it were, has to be kind of manufactured because it's not based in in providing a product or land ownership or social utility. So, and the constant competition people are put into, and you start wondering, actually, no, why is it? And that leads into another theory as to where these things come from. The idea that everybody's competing, but everybody has to find, quote unquote, the best man, the best woman. And for, people having to conform to a largely illusionary archetype of what they should be. And these kind of social roles that make people think, and then when you think about it, you're like, wait, why? Why do I have to do this? Why? Why is it that everyone must do X, Y, or Z? Why? And when you're a writer, your audience will have certain assumptions going in. And you may have certain assumptions going into your writing. And if your world isn't like that, and if there are things that mismatch, people are going to take notice. Okay, let's talk about the two paintings. So, here's somebody. J.R.R. Tolkien, writer of things like The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, and some credit with the invention of the expanded universe, although he himself said that that wasn't the case, saying that this has been a long-standing part of pre-Norman literature and folklore. And yeah, why am I bringing him up? Well, people often talk about his writing. What does it mean? Is it allegory? I've seen all sorts of things that apparently the orcs are meant to represent. Is it racial? Racial, but in a different way. I've seen people saying that yes, his use of the racialized language of various racialized language with regards to orcs and others was actually a way of poking at the way his society saw it, because if you read the book, you'll realize they're not even evil. They're driven by someone that is, and who is not an orc. Orc essentially and whether Sauron's meant to be communism, fascism, whatever, that's another debate. So is it meant to be like, showing that actually these moral assumptions people make about race are just not the case? I've seen that interpretation. I've seen interpretations about that it being about capitalism, others the working class, and others talking about even in terms of, now brace yourself, this might be a funny one, but sexuality. Yeah, the idea that the orcs represent toxic masculinity. Now, what did Tolkien make of this? Well, probably quite a few of these theories were written after he was dead. You know, he died before much in the way of critical race theory had been written, and so on and so forth. But what he said about allegory was he hates allegory. He hated allegory, he said. He even said, I do not put it in my books. Now, you might be thinking, yeah, but death of the author. We take the text, we find the meaning. Now, I'm not necessarily ascribing to that theory. So here's another person from even longer ago, St. Thomas Aquinas. Now, he came up with this idea about art, and hence why I'm talking about the two paintings, because there's technically three in the analogy, but St. Aquinas talks about two. A painter paints a painting, and there's the physical painting. And but he doesn't just create that physical painting. He also creates the painting in his mind. Yeah, I apologise for the very gendered language of St. Thomas Aquinas here, although that might be just a translation error, I don't know. But the painter doesn't just create a painting in the painter's mind, but also in the mind of the viewing public. Each member of the public then who sees the painting, they have their own meaning and derive their own understanding of the painting from the same physical painting that's not necessarily the same as what the painter thought of the painting. And so you have these different ideas. You have one meaning, your audience has another meaning, and you know what? That's fine. I mean, a question I sometimes get is, what happens if my politics ends up in my work? Or how do I get my politics into my work? And I just say, well, don't worry about it too much. You're not here to lecture. And to be honest, your audience won't respond to you very well if they feel like they're being lectured. When writing works of fiction, you're here to entertain. That's the first bit. You're here to engage the audience's mind. And if you engage them with ideas that are good, that are interesting, a nice, interesting setting, they might see an allegory you don't. And they may not see an allegory that you do. And all that is perfectly okay. Because you know what? When you treat your audience with respect, sure, they may disagree with you, but they're going to talk about your work. They're going to but hey, it's almost like a respectful dialogue between the creative minds. You've got certain ideas that'll be in your work. They've got certain ideas that are in their head seeing the work. So enjoy the ride and respect your audience. And well, we're going to have a little case study to talk about that next.
Hi everyone. So, this is the part where we talk about Command and Conquer Generals, which, yes, I've said before was my favourite part IP in the C&C franchise. But, I mean, I never really played much of the campaigns myself. I've not really been much of a fan of C&C's campaigns, if I'm honest. But this is how I, mostly spend my time smashing around in the skirmish mode. But there was a nagging doubt in the back of my head. One of those things that sort of made me think, And, because, how to put this politely, there is perhaps something that can be said about the discussion of race when it comes to generals. And, well, firstly, I'd just like to say, it's fair to say that I needed help with discussing these ideas. Partly because a lot of stuff is being said. And I hope that this segment, which, I'd just like to thank everyone at the ASPECs Committed to Anti-Racism Discord server, Krista and everyone at the ASPECs Committed to Anti-Racism Discord server, for their help in discussing these ideas, formulating into things, and, yeah, because, hey, these are concepts a lot of people need to learn about, because we live in a society that is a lot more varied. There's lots of different kinds of people in it, and some people are marginalised. And now I just want to say, if you are Chinese or Arab and you don't take any offence at the portrayal of China and the GLA in the game, that's fine. You are allowed to feel how you wish to feel. Although, feelings aren't something you control, but that's something in you, and that should be respected. And one of the things that perhaps some progressives risk a bit of times is, when it comes to handling marginalised groups, is the way they sort of get paternalistic, thinking that they have all the answers. It's one of the hazards you have to work on. So, but as a important point, there are some tropes in this game. Tropes that are not very helpful, perhaps. It can be quite Islamophobic. And yes, I know from what I've seen of other people's playthroughs, one could say, but Islam isn't actually mentioned. The GLA's ideology is always left in specific. Well, trouble is, with the Middle Eastern aesthetic, which even if the devs didn't originally wish for, but the publishers insisted on, I wasn't able to confirm that story, but if that is true, but even if that is, but the thing is, with regards to the product that went on sale in 2003, yeah, they didn't need to mention Islam when you've got all these kind of images up. Just portraying people the way they are, trying to make out people as an entire group as basically terroristic. Now, the use, Dr. Frax heavily resembling Chemical Ali, who, yes, was convicted of genocide, of crimes against humanity, but without any real depth to it. And this is hitting at where some of the problems lie. Without any depth to it, it really comes across as almost like it's just an innate thing rather than an actual system that creates terrorism. Because yes, at the time, and yeah, there are lots, yes, not to mention all these stereotypical accents, and yes, I know, I've read the IMDb pages as well, and there are quite a lot of Asian actors in the game, but, well, very few of them were Chinese or Arab. A lot of them were Vietnamese Americans, and Vietnam and China are not the same thing. Sorry if that sounds too patronising, but a lot of people don't realise this. They'd have this sort of idea that Asia is just one great big cultural block with no diversity in it at all, and that just ain't really what's happening. Yeah. And also, the way China's represented in the game, because it was controversial even when it came out. The PRC banned, well, technically you could play it in your own home as long as you didn't use the online multiplayer, but no internet cafes, no buying import copies. You could basically only buy it from Hong Kong or Macau to play it on the Chinese mainland. And their objections being the destruction of various important Chinese landmarks and the rather liberal use of incendiary and nuclear weapons by the Chinese military. And, well, Jess is just saying hello. Aww. Do you want to say hello to the viewers, Jess? Aww. This is a bit of a... Oh, sorry. Maybe because this was a strenuous topic, Jess thought, you know, this is a difficult topic that a lot of people might feel quite offended by. Because this touches on a lot of problems, and Jess came to say hello, I guess. But, point is there are these tropes used, and say with China's use of napalm and nukes, which is kind of ironic, really, because at the time there's something called the International Convention on certain conventional weapons, which heavily limits the use of thermobaric and flame-based weaponry. Not banned entirely, just can only be used on military targets and so that. Now, the thing is, when Generals came out in 2003, the People's Republic of China had signed the protocol. The United States of America hadn't. And unlike their counterparts in something like Red Alert, in the Red Alert games, for example, you know, where the Allies are freezing people or catapulting them to another dimension, which, to be quite frank, both of those sound like weapons that cause unnecessary suffering. Well, that's not really what we have the Americans do in Generals. In a lot of ways, they're very smooth and sleek, as it were. The sort of, yes, there's an element of parody. They're very, you know, preserving freedom kind of thing and so that, but yeah, they're still the very cool, futuristic kind of thing. And even if I found them boring to play, that doesn't mean that they weren't represented in that sort of manner of the sort of very clean, very cool, very good guy kind of way, perhaps. And yes, and, you know, speaking of which, yes, while China uses things like landmines, now I know what you're going to say. They never signed the Ottawa Treaty. Well, neither did the United States. And there are protocols China has signed up to on the use of landmines. And there are landmines. And there are protocol... Yeah. So, it does seem a little bit unfair that they're the sort of fire and numbers faction, which is not really realistic. Especially when, I mean, I know to an extent you can see that they're more of an artillery faction in some ways because their frontline units are very sturdy. And yes, the game was set before the Chinese military modernization program started in 2015, but let's be honest with ourselves, that doesn't mean that they have to be depicted in this sort of stereotypical horde mode kind of faction. You know, they're not, which also collides very, and because Generals is so tied to nations rather than, say, ideologies like Tib Wars or Red Alert, it does make them a bit. It does very much tie it into these ideologies. I mean, the Red Guard infantry unit, they are so out of date. I mean, they're not used like that. You know, they haven't been used like that since 1978, after a not very successful Chinese war with Vietnam. And also, not to mention the way Black Lotus is portrayed in this sort of has a lot of these dragon lady style tropes, which, in case you don't know, is a sort of thing where an East Asian woman is depicted as a very sexual and very submissive kind of woman. I personally didn't pick that up, but one, I am rubbish at picking up sexual signals. Two, I was playing the UK version of the game, which I mean, I don't believe that it was that heavily censored compared to the North America release. Third, it's not a stereotype applied to East Asian women in Britain. In fact, from my experience, it's more applied to West Asian women, Indian women, for example, or Eastern European, Slavic women. There's this sort of sexual and submissive person. Plus, I don't have to live with it. And that's an important point. This is not something I have to live with. And speaking of Orientalist tropes, China's propaganda centre. Now, yes, you might say that this wasn't the devs' intention, because the technology centre was their intention, but was cut from the game. Game possibly from the publisher's insistence, like Black Lotus's more assertive voice lines, which modders in, for example, the Rise of the Reds mod happened to restore. But it still plays into this idea of an Asian country that is a sort of nation of automatons behind a leader, where everyone just blindly follows the leader's will. But more importantly, people, there's nothing different about Asian people. They're not inherently more or less inclined to freedom. Now, and yes, and of course a lot of the ending of the campaign, with the idea of China coming in, wiping the terrorists out of Europe who have driven out the Americans, does play a lot into the whole fear the rise of China. Point of order, Ed. You can object to the PRC without it being racist, because they do have a very bad record on human rights. Yes, it is possible to criticise a government that's not white, but we do have to be careful not to fall in to racist tropes, using our defence of human rights as a shield for racism. Yeah. And so the question is there anything specific? Does the game depict... Well, for a start, it calls them China, not the People's Republic of China, which is a big difference. This is not an ideology we're talking about. In a lot of ways, it's a nationality. And it's perfectly within within the PRC's capacity to not torture people for their religion, to not censor their internet, all those things, to not stifle free speech. And many within China are trying their best to bring that about. There are plenty of reformer movements within China, within the PRC. Plus, Generals kind of doesn't talk about the human rights issues. On the surface, it portrays the PRC, or China as they keep calling them, as liberators. So if we do get a fear the rise of China vibe, it's not really a fear the rise of a human rights violator vibe. And the thing is, you can't stop being Chinese. You can stop violating people's human rights, and most Chinese people don't do that anyway. It's their government. Because I'm going to say this now, I do not agree with collective punishment. People should be held accountable for what they have control over, not what they don't. As I say, we can all do something to help one another. So let's start by having a more positive approach to people. And not try and demonise whole groups of people just because of the actions of a particular government. And let's be honest, the human rights record of a lot of Western countries has not always been that great either. In fact, well, let's face it, there are a lot of issues, and we're going to come into that in a later set. We're going to come into that shortly. Fine words, Ed. But we're not going to let you get away with it. But I'm not going to let you get away with this. Just spreading blatant anti-gamer propaganda. Oh, come on. I mean, you didn't mind when I was being critical of Empire Earth 3. And that one didn't even have the plausible deniability of, you could argue it being about non-state actors and governments. Given the fact that the factions were very much called the West, the Middle East and the Far East. At least you didn't want to step in then. Yeah, but nobody liked that game, Ed. And, anyway, we all know why you're really doing it. You're really saying all this stuff. It's just because, you know, you're around proggies and the dragon awakes. You know, you're just trying to maintain a smooth ride so that one day you can let loose the juice between one of them feminist frequency woman's thighs. Seriously, mate? You're gonna go there? I mean, that is kind of disgusting. I want to make it better. Intention is important. The point is, it's about to understand why a person may find a media we enjoy upsetting or hard. And so, what should we do? We should. Okay, everybody. Welcome. Well, I can refute that allegation quite strongly. Because I'll be honest with you, there's only one woman who I want my genitals inside of. And that woman is me. Yeah, me. I've been wanting to let you know. Just trying to find the best way to tell everybody. But no. I'm a woman. A transgender woman. I started hormone replacement therapy back in August. I'm still going to be Ed. The change in a lot of ways is perhaps maybe more physical than some, but hey, everyone's expression and understanding is different. You know, that's part of the whole point of the infinite varieties of infinite combinations of human beings that we can be. Yeah. You may not like me. You may not like it. I understand. But I just want to be thankful and happy for everyone who was supportive. All the Discord servers who've let me use my preferred pronouns of she/her, which includes aspects committed to anti-racism, by the way. And by the way, they weren't the people I was referring to as the white white people who held my whiteness against me. Those people were a long time ago, but ACAR are more. They're more in the category of people who still put up with me, even for all the stupid stuff I say. But the point is about that I want to say this. I'm thankful for everyone who has been supportive, who is being supportive, and will be supportive. Flamingo and Harry's, when they told me that, yeah, as far as we're concerned, and if you're transphobic, homophobic, aphobic, take your business elsewhere. We don't want it. The Catholic Agency for Overseas Development, who told me that, yes, I can be transgender and still volunteer for them, because part of their mission is to respect the dignity of all human life. The Blood Donation Service, who let me change from Mr. to Miss. I asked them what I need to do. They said they'll update the system. The GP, the Passport Authority. I mean, yes, granted, it's probably easier because only the title, not the name, is changing. And all the people who've been helpful and supportive on the way, all the people who've been kind and loving, all the people who've been caring and supportive, and I just want to say thank you to them. Because, in a way, it's about helping me feel better about myself. Being able to look in that mirror and feel like it's actually me, not just some lumpy thing not just some thing that I'm piloting. And so, it's about being able to feel better in the world. Feel like yourself, like you can be yourself in the world. That's all. That's all, and that's probably all most of us want. And in a way, that's kind of why I'm broaching this topic of generals. Hey, it's a 20-something-year-old game that's actually relatively hard to get a copy of, I've found. Haven't found any digital marketplaces that sell it. Haven't found it. Even the EA store doesn't sell it. You know, you have to get it in a disc format. Now, you know, the disc I've currently got it installed on my retro computer with was made in 2008. From a long time ago that they happened, you know, that was the last copy Amazon even had at the time. It was currently out of stock, and that wasn't even a copy of it itself. It was part of a box set of Command & Conquer: The First Decade. And so I'm saying, I'm not trying to tell anyone how to feel about it. If you're Chinese or Arab and you love the game, that's just as well as if you are concerned about people onboarding racist ideas about you from these games. What I'm here to talk about, so the whole point of this whole question was, how do we make it better? So that if there is a Generals 2 that isn't cancelled, how do we make it better? I mean, probably the big underlying root problem of why these tropes managed to slip into the game was that it is what we call in literature ripped from the headlines. You know, the Tib War series are essentially fantasy with Edge of Tomorrow and sci-fi weapons. You know, a magic crystal with immense power and immense destruction that one side wants to keep under control and one side wants to proliferate. Yeah, that's almost similar to the One Ring, slightly. Or Red Alert, which has a Cold War gone hot that came out with stuff like mind control scientist, freeze-rays, dimension-hopping weaponry, and not to mention starting with Albert Einstein's time travel shenanigans. And yeah, you might say a lot of the tropes in Generals are part of the satire. You know, there's a lot of discussion I've seen on, is it war on terror propaganda or a send-up of war on terror propaganda? I don't know the answers to these questions, but let's face it. Question of how do we make it better? Now, I'm not going to tell you how to represent a Chinese person or an Arab. There are plenty of Arabs and Chinese people you can get involved in the process. They're much better at that than me, because they have the lived experience. Experience. And point is, we are people. So why not tie the factions in any future general series to an ideology? You know, like how Red Alert has the Soviets who are kind of into communism-ish, or something akin to that, and the Allies who have a very sort of liberal democracy kind of thing vibe going on. You can have those two thrown together. Have that, you know, because then you don't have to tie it to any nationality. Make them a bit broader. Plus, it's 2023. We have scepticism now of a lot of the feelings behind the war on terror. You know, people are less pro-war on terror than they used to be. You know, there's a lot more scepticism of whether it's in fact just sort of US and EU imperialism. And yeah, I say that because, well, probably the most unrealistic thing about the game, about Command and Conquer Generals, is China wanting to dominate the world. From everything I've seen in their foreign policies, they're actually more into a regionalist worldview. Basically, each major power has their area of influence that everyone else leaves alone. So, I mean, almost like Bismarckian politics, only with an open trade emphasis rather than getting protectionist after a while. Yeah. So, I mean, China doesn't do cultural imperialism in places like Africa, Europe, or what have you. They want open trade, sure. But is it? But do they insist on things? You know, they have no I'm sure the PRC has no problem with there being pride events in Tamworth. They might find it objectionable if we went in and tried to force them to happen in Tambov, but that's by and by. So maybe a more ideological focus for these things. Perhaps give the GLA an ideology that makes sense, as opposed to generic, vague, anti-imperialism. Also, maybe we should add more fantasy and levity. One thing that put me off the Generals' campaigns was they all felt too serious and too miserable. It's like, no, this isn't the game. This isn't fun. This isn't this isn't fun. You know, I started making up my own stories with time travel. With, like, people go back to does some fun stuff in the skirmish mode, because I was like, yeah, this isn't fun. And maybe let the Western powers fight dirty, as it were. After all, and hey, some of the modders have done that. In Rise of the Reds, for example, the European Continental Alliance, sorry, they have neutron bomb cannons that are which have issues with causing unnecessary suffering by basically sort of melting people to death in atomic radiation. They have freeze rays. They use cluster bombs. You know, when you get the upgrade, you'll even get the voice saying, "Oi, Greaser, we need more bombs in our bombs." Hey, don't worry, I am part Scottish, so I guess that, you know, like, hopefully I haven't made too bad of the accent, but you get the point. But you get the point. And they even have a specific mine layer unit. Just like in the original Red Alert game, how the Allies have a unit specifically designed for laying landmines, and even a thief designed to go in and steal stuff from other people. You know, why only the Chinese do stuff like that? Plus, and as I say, more levity and perhaps more fantasy. Bring in more Edge of Tomorrow stuff. All sort of weird sci-fi-ish kind of things, not a sort of, you know, and make that something that everyone does. And as I say, fantasy. Maybe have some time travel shenanigans. You know, all the stuff that makes you not think that actually catapulting people to a completely different universe is actually quite a horrific weapon. Because it's, you know, Red Alert has that air of absurdity like some cheesy 1980s action movie. You know, if we're going to make it, if it's going to be a satire on war on terror thinking, really ham it up. I mean, hey, why not have the USA's faction, as it were, be McWorld? You know, really make them out to be, you know, we can bring out some of that skepticism and have the GLA be not just Middle Eastern anymore. That would be fun. Just think of all the fun, you know. That's the thing, we can make it, and that's why it's not just killing the fun. I'm not trying to kill the fun here. I'm trying to make it more fun for more people. Anyway.
So, let's get to that thing we were talking about before. The culture war. Well, of course, you might have heard about it. The idea of identity, belief, education, public life and private life, all in conflict with one another. Across your daily life. And of course, the idea that each one is fighting for world domination, to repaint the earth in their own image. I mean, except in Ukraine, where they apparently were planted together to fight Russia, but, well, such is mythology. Of course, you might be thinking, all this conflict and stuff, I mean, people don't want war. People don't want war with their neighbour. They wish to eat, to meet, you know, those needs of life. So what's really going on? Well, let me show you the actual front line of culture war. On one side, we have labour. And the other side, we have the nation state and capital. Now we've got a capitalist nation state that suppresses identities, beliefs, educations, private and public self, reducing them down to perhaps mere battle flags, so that the elite can hold as much power and wealth as possible. Sure, they'll gussy it up, pretend they're protecting others, keeping society safe and holding it all together. Yes, as they beat down the marginalised, take away your human rights and trample your civil rights down. So what about Labour? Labour wishes to lift these up, all to grow together, as a part of the human condition and the joy of life. Charity? Maybe. Of course, in a way, it's Labour serving its own interest, as these come from the bottom up, where Labour comes from. You may want to wonder how this happens. Well, fear not. For we are about to find this out as we head towards the fourth political system. So now, let us talk about that fourth political system. Well, I don't know exactly what to call it, but some people have their own names, and it's about labour owning the means of production. Labour, of course, being those who work the means of production own it, and there is no class distinction between the worker and the owner. And what does this perhaps look like? Well, the needs to eat are coordinated, both cooperative between individual needs and wants, and of course the wider social needs and wants discussed together or working together in cooperation, in a sort of cooperative management. The need to meet is decided and regulated by the people themselves, forming their own needs to meet based on mutual support and helping one another access things. And how might this be regulated, you may think? Well, simply through mutual assistance. You know, we're all in this together, we all help each other out. Might sound interesting. And you might think about these institutions and how mutual assistance works with those. Well, it does kind of make it hard for any one identity, belief, education, private self, or public self to be placed upon one atop the other, since, well, without a hierarchy, you can't exactly be top of the hierarchy. But of course, there is a fair question to ask. But you might be thinking, is this even possible? What I describe as the labour ownership of the means of production? Well, one might ask, why not? After all, people do help each other find what they need and want. People form loving, mutually supportive relationships, and people help each other out in times of need. We all know that charity and other such organisations exist. And you might think, yeah, but that's just small scale, but people can rally together. People do that on big scale to look after that which is important to them. And you know, even economically, just where I live here in the UK, two of our biggest supermarkets, the co-op, let's go into that one briefly, that's a cooperative. It actually shares the profits of its labour with and also owner of Waitrose, so I guess two of them now. And so you might be thinking, so you can see this instinctual sort of mutual supportive social animal behaviours that we see on the small scale, we can also see on the big scale. Just it perhaps needs a bit more coordination and perhaps a reshuffling of things so that there isn't that kind of class distinction between the owner and the worker. Although one way of looking at is something possible, who knows? After all, in history there was perhaps a time when capitalism seemed impossible in the wake of feudalism. Maybe we don't have as much historical record, but back in the day perhaps there were times when people thought there's no way that a feudal lord can organise all these different small decentralised communities. Both of those happened. Maybe it is possible. It's hard to tell that. So that would be if it's not possible, why not? So guess it's the end of the video towards that now. And I just wanted to finish off because with a question sometimes people ask me, what is my political position? Well, I mean, it's probably not that interesting because I'm what you might call a moderate. You know, things like worker ownership of the means of production, cooperative management of public goods, the only restraint on human freedom being that which is necessary to uphold the dignity of all human life affected by their actions. Actions for political organisation to be done from the individual to the community all the way up to the
well, the entire human family interlocked with mutual assistance for the redistribution of the means of coercion, authority and sovereignty to the individuals and communities to be held in common and managed cooperatively. You know, pretty moderate stuff. So, well, it's been a bit of a long video and might as well finish on a song. Through life drawn together, a friendship forever, each person and commune in freedom's dignity, the greatness of humankind built up from the people, each one though different, part of community. Each through the work of brain and hand, each building up the motherland. Blessed be the people, dignified and free, through all our joys and daily toil, planting into every heart soil a home for all in the human family. Through days dark and stormy, the capitalists bled us, blotting out the bright sun of freedom above. Nation states that led us divided the people and taught us to hate while our hearts long to love. Each through the work of brain and hand, each building up the motherland. Blessed be the people, dignified and free, through all our joys and daily toil, planting into every heart soil a home for all in the human family. We threw off the invader, we rebuilt the future, and brought to our homeland a love built for all. The great human family held strong through the sorrows, ourselves individual, our world communal. Each through the work of brain and hand, each building up the motherland. Blessed be the people, dignified and free, through all our joys and daily toil, planting into every heart soil, all home for all in the human family. Well, probably not the best at singing, but hope this helped when coming up with how to write your politics. And whatever your politics, if you want to, value the dignity of all, if it's dignifying to all human life, well, it was lovely having you here.